Hello and welcome to Cybersecurity Strategies for Business Continuity. Today's webinar is sponsored by Rubrik and Microsoft and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you ask. That Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues that you might be experiencing. A browser refresh will fix most audio or slide advancement issues, but if that doesn't work, just let us know in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Now next, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources, and I'd especially like to call your attention to several from Rubrik and Microsoft. There's a Zero Labs report, there's a Payette success story, there's a page about Microsoft and Rubrik together, and a link for taking the fear out of ransomware with Zero Trust Security. So I highly recommend all of those, plus the usual Actual Tech Media links in there, the link to the Guerrilla Guide Book Club, which is Actual Tech Media's great printed resources on technology topics, as well as a link to the ATM Events Center, which has our calendar of upcoming webinars. So I encourage you again to access all of those resources now and share them with your friends and your colleagues. Also, at the end of this webinar event, we'll be awarding a $300 Visa gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for that prize. Official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. And finally, one of the best benefits of this event is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenters. To help encourage your questions, we have a special additional prize for you. That's another Visa gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. So at the end of the event, we'll look at all the questions that came in, pick out the very best one, and contact that prize winner. So with all that housekeeping out of the way, let's get to today's fantastic content. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our speakers today. We have Natasha Loeffler-Little, who's a Principal Product Manager at Rubrik, and we have Adam Eckerly, who's a Director of Technical Marketing at Rubrik. So Natasha and Adam, welcome.
Thanks, Scott. Good to be on.
Thank you.
It's good to have you guys here. I know you've got a fun discussion coming up with a lot of buzzword breakdown, so I'm really looking forward to it. Take it away.
Yeah, we'd love to start the conversation with breaking down some of these buzzwords that are used with BCDR and specifically Zero Trust. And in this context, what we're trying to do is not just passively use the words, but really unpack them to help make sure that you're looking at the importance of them in your own BCDR plan, right? And I think the first one, I'll go ahead and take this one, Adam, is data security, right? And in this case, I don't know if it's so much a buzzword, but I want to get specific about the data part of data security, right? Like historically, we've been talking about security as something more physical or perimeter or network security, which is important and always will be, because there will continue to be, unfortunately, natural disasters. But really what's happened, especially since 2020 and the rise of ransomware attacks and cybercrime with bad actors, is that they're specifically targeting the data because it is the heart of what is in your business, right? What runs your business. So while we could go ahead and gloss over security here, my personal thing with this one was really highlighting the importance and the focus on data and making sure that a good solid plan also specifically takes a moment to call out, how are we protecting the data, all right? And that's, yeah. If you have something to add there, Adam.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's so important to remember the value that data has to our businesses. And, when we think about data security, then I think that segues into the next topic, which is zero trust and actually how we implement data security. Oops, sorry. We double click there. Oh, you already got it. Zero trust. Sorry about that.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So how do we implement zero trust, or how do we implement data security around our data? And that's really what zero trust is. And you've undoubtedly heard about zero trust a million different times, probably just in the last couple of weeks, from everywhere, all directions. And so again, what we're trying to do today is really try to break these terms down and understand, like, what does this actually mean? Like, let's take away the marketing of it. Let's take away the buzzwordy aspect of it, and let's try to make sure you know how it applies to what you're doing in your day-to-day jobs. And the first is take away all that stuff and just look at the NIST framework. So the NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Has nothing to do with any tech company. And so it's a government sponsored body, essentially, that creates standards that anybody can then reference and implement in their technologies. And so if you look at how NIST defines zero trust, you always sort of have that North Star of translating whatever it is that you're looking at from a technology's perspective back to what zero trust actually is and what it does for you. And so some of the things that NIST defines as zero trust are the ability to identify threats, protect your data, detect cyber threats, respond, and then finally recover. Mm-hmm. And the keys that you can sort of apply to those are data observability, right? That's the ability to sort of see what's going on around your data. You're identifying threats and risks, being able to classify your data, knowing where important or critical data or sensitive data lies. If you're a credit card processor and you're bound by things like PCI, then you have data classification policies in place. And so knowing where that data is and having specific policies around that data is super helpful and part of that zero trust framework. And then also data resilience and recoverability, which we'll talk a little bit more about here in the coming minutes. But those are some of the kind of the high level things that you need to be thinking about when you think about zero trust, and just ultimately trust no one, trust nothing. Gone are the days where we can sort of assume that things that are in our internal networks are trustworthy and that we don't have to be as diligent in those areas. Now we just have to assume that there is a breach and there are cyber threats and we're going to get attacked. And, you have to sort of heighten your guard just everywhere across the board.
Yeah, I like that. And
so then,
and what you were saying, Adam, is like at that high level, if we're talking about this because we brought it up, is like it's often used when you're talking about your BCDR planning that like, oh, zero trust. And it's like there's sort of a one-liner there, right? That trust no one, be diligent. And then there's the meat of it when you're actually making the plan and ensuring that you and your team can act on the plan when you need it, is to really double click in and look at the NIST standards in greater detail to figure out how that applies to your business specifically, and know that there are some really strong governing rules about what zero trust actually means.
Yeah, 100%. So now let's take a look at one of the ways that organizations can implement zero trust and make sure that this is really a mechanism that they can ensure that data is secure. And that's logical air gap. Now, if we rewind the clock a little bit and remove the logical, right, and just talking about air gap, I'm dating myself a little bit here to talk about things like sneakernet, right? That you have a system that is just physically disconnected from any other network. Think about the original Mission Impossible movie with Tom Cruise, where he's dangling from the ceiling and trying to get data off of a computer, right? That is a physical air gap system. It's not connected to anything. And while that's a great way to provide security for a system, that means that data is completely offline, not accessible. It's not convenient to access. It's not convenient to get new data in or get data out. And so it's kind of locked away, whether it's Mission Impossible or data on a tape that's stored in a mountain vault somewhere. It's just not convenient to get that data once it's there. So one of the reasons why we have logical air gaps now is because we can get almost as good of security with having the data online and available. So there's various different technologies that allow you to achieve a logical air gap. Really, the point of today is not necessarily to talk about specific technologies, but just to get you thinking that, hey, logical air gap, it's been around for a while. The technology is pretty mature, and you should definitely consider using logical air gaps in your infrastructure and your architectures rather than trying to really make it hard on yourselves and your business by taking data and just vaulting it away where no one can access it. Because ultimately there's a cost with that, right? The cost of not having that data online, the time it takes to access that data. If you're using that data in a BCDR scenario where you need to recover from that data, right? That's going to take you that much longer to get that data back into production. Whereas if you use logical air gap technologies, that data is online and available, and now you can get that data recovered much more quickly. Mm-hmm. Anything to add, Natasha?
I was just going to say, emphasizing here the R and the BCDR part of the topic, that recoverability, and we'll talk about that in a little bit too. But I think that was awesome, and I've got the Mission Impossible music playing in my head now, so that's going to be the theme for the rest of the call.
Happy Friday!
Yeah, right. Exactly.
So
another one.
So this kind of dovetails into the next topic, which is immutability. So one of the things that's very important when we talk about logical air gaps is having immutable data. If you think about having data online and accessible, you don't want that data to be able to be modified or changed or deleted, which is what immutability is, the inability to modify or change data. And so immutable data in the context of backups is really important. So if you think about backups as your last line of defense, which you've probably heard time and time again over the last few years, and it's completely true, is that backup data becomes ultra important, especially when you think about recovering from a cyber attack or when you need to call in your BCDR plan into action. And so you need to make sure that data is secure, it's immutable, right? You need to know that it's good data. And ways to do that are making sure that data is immutable from the start. There are certain technologies out there that allow you to sort of bolt on immutability and say, like, okay, I want this subset of my data to be immutable between these timeframes. And now I kind of have that little silo of data, and I don't have to worry about it. If I need to recover from it, I can. That's fine, except that attackers are hip to that idea. And so what they are doing now is they're specifically going after backups, and they're taking those immutable pockets of data that you have, and they're saying, okay, I'm going to change the policy so that data becomes mutable sooner, like tomorrow. And then they can go in and basically corrupt or destroy your backups so that you can't recover, forcing you to pay a ransom or whatever goal they're trying to achieve. So it's important to consider solutions and technologies that have immutability baked in. That's not a bolt-on. That's not something that you have to choose what data is immutable and what data is not. And there's all kinds of considerations around that, but the main idea is just making sure that when you consider immutability, that it's there for all of your data and that it's dependable and not something that can be turned on or off, because attackers are getting smart to those abilities.
Yeah. And I think the addition I'd just make to that again is like this evolution of why we really need to stay close to our BCDR plans is not just natural disasters, but really humans with business models to make money off of doing bad things and taking your data, right? So they're going to figure that out. So be more hip and savvy than the bad guys. The skill gap. This is one, I think it comes up in a lot of these types of conversations. And the obvious fact is that there's this growing shortage of talent to help get the job done. And I also think that, one of the inhibitors we know to having a good BCDR plan is sometimes saying, well, I don't have the budget or I don't have the people to actually do it. And the first thing that I'd encourage when you're looking at the skill gap within your own company isn't just filling the roles or the jobs that have to be done, but also looking at how the team can work most quickly and smoothly across the company when a disaster happens. A good example is if there is a ransomware event, that's actually going to involve, an incident response team with representatives from security operations and IT operations, and they're actually not used to working with each other. And the number one thing that you'll see happening there is the speed in which they're able to respond together. And that is the leading indicator for why companies tend to pay the ransom when attacked, is they can't figure it out in less than 4 days. So I think, making a plug here for one of the things Rubrik has specifically done is integrated with Microsoft Sentinel to help those two teams work together in their respective core work areas, and then being able to communicate to one another and align those actions. So it doesn't have to necessarily be that. We'd love that for that to be something you consider, but looking at beyond just the actual job. The other thing I'm going to make a plug for is Scott had mentioned that you have handouts here. If you want to click over there, there's a link to the Rubrik Zero Labs, the state of data security. And there's really good data and some suggestions in there specific to this skill gap conversation of really talking about this idea of not just filling headcounts, but optimizing the resources you have to make sure that that part of your plan is solid. All right. Do you have anything to add there, Adam?
Yeah. So I kind of teased this earlier. And I think it's worth kind of digging into a little bit, is just the idea of backups providing value other than recoverability, right? You think about backups as being like a honeypot of data that is just sitting there, not doing anything. It's like a superhero that's waiting for the bat signal to be called, right? And there's so much value that you can get out of that data. You can look at that data and gain insights around when a dormant piece of ransomware may have actually entered into the system, right? You hear attacks, for example, the SolarWinds attacks from a couple of years ago, that ransomware had been sitting in that network for, I think it was 6 to 9 months before it actually activated and caused problems. And so, looking at your backups, you could go back and look at when that occurred, and then, sort of restore from that clean point in time, so that then you don't have to worry about things like reinfection. So that's just one example. There are many others. You can gain all kinds of insights from your backup data, and just think about that and think about what other kinds of insights, what tools you may already have that you could, if you just point them at your backup data, what value you could get out of that. And of course, Rubrik and Microsoft offer lots of different tools to help in those areas. But again, just want you to be thinking about that. And it's a treasure trove of data, so take advantage of it.
Yeah. And then our final one, multi-factor authentication.
Yeah, this is, I really view this as like low-hanging fruit from a security perspective. Like if you, keep going back to the superhero, if you want to be an IT superhero, this is an easy way for you to get your cape, so to speak. If you have systems that are multi-factor capable and it's not enabled, like this is so easy to go in and either tie into a single sign-on, or lots of solutions have their own native multi-factor authentication mechanisms now. Enable it, talk to your groups that need to be aware of that, and just get it enabled. Like it's really a no-brainer. If you think about how attackers get into your network, a lot of times, I don't want to say most because I don't know what the current data is, but I'll say a lot is social engineering, phishing attacks. They're playing on the weakness of us humans, who are silly and like to click on things without thinking about it. And then they get our credentials, right? And that's all they need to get in and start wreaking havoc. Multi-factor authentication is a great way, maybe not to prevent them in all cases, but certainly to slow them down and make it much, much more difficult for them to get into your network. So look at your systems, identify which ones are MFA capable today. If you have systems that aren't MFA capable, definitely think about, is that the right solution for you? Or talk to the vendors and find out if they've got updates coming or anything that allows you to implement this, because you can really save the day just by enabling multi-factor authentication.
And who doesn't want to save the day? So
I know, right?
Well, yeah, and I think on that, flowing right into it, there's so much that we could have talked about, but we did have a limited amount of time. And Adam, you and I shared to prep for this the top 3 things we really think everyone on this call should be paying attention to. It's like the things that grind our gears when people don't pay attention to it, right? And the first one for me was simplicity. There's a lot of things I could say about this, but you want to have a BCDR plan that is personal to your company, right? It has to work and should be smart with all the things that we've been talking about. But we've got to do it in such a way that the team's actually going to be able to keep up with it, implement the support that you need for it, and then act on it when you actually have an event that requires you to do that. And so I think I'm going to go back and reference that skill gap conversation we just had, and do a usability check on the plan that you're creating to make sure that it is usable by individual team members and then across the teams. I also think that, the Payette story that we've got up here and recently published, which you can also find in the handout section, they were prepared before an attack happened. And good work went into this, but I also heard simplicity, right? And when an attack happened, they were actually able to recover so quickly that the hacker didn't even have time to leave a ransomware note. And those are the types of success stories that we hear, that we say, yeah, this is the type of ease that we want. And just there's like 2 things that I think are really unique to how Rubrik is addressing this. And one of them is, across your on-prem and cloud environments, having a single data management plane to manage your backups and your recovery efforts is one way in which, or one example that I could cite, that I look at how technology can support making things simpler. A second is having an SLA engine, and this is again a Rubrik specific example, to be able to set backup schedules quickly and easily across complex environments and then be able to monitor them. So again, when we look at like not just initial setup of a plan to make sure that you can actually get it going, it's also about that ongoing monitoring and then the response. So anything you want to add to that simplicity factor, or should we keep it simple and move on?
Oh, well, I will squeeze in one thing, and that's again like the SLA piece of not having to manage all the different workloads you have individually. Being able to create an SLA policy for create one SLA policy that governs how databases are protected, how Microsoft 365 objects are created, how virtual machines are protected. That's one policy. And so look for technologies, and hopefully Rubrik, but look for technologies that give you that simplicity so you can spend less time managing those individual backup jobs and just use policy-driven software to manage all of that protection for you.
That's awesome.
And then, the other thing, or another thing that grinds our gears is flexibility. So there's a bunch of different variables, your team, your business needs, technology, dependency, all these things are constantly changing, let alone, the cybercrime sort of landscape. All the threats are evolving all the time. And so you should be looking for your BCDR or your cyber recovery plan that gives you the flexibility in order to react to these changing needs and this changing landscape. Sometimes I think of BCDR plans of this like 5-inch thick 3-ring binder that we put a bunch of work in, we put it together, everybody signed off on it, and then we put it back on the shelf behind us, and then hopefully we never have to look at it again. That's kind of the old way, and I'm certainly guilty of being in that sort of way of thinking. We just can't get away with that anymore. We have to treat our BCDR plans as sort of a living document, so to speak. And so just make sure that you're always constantly evaluating your plans. You're looking at what's going to happen when you do recover. Reinfection is a big problem. And actually, a majority of customers that suffer an attack have a high chance of a reattack. And there's a few ways that we know how this happens. And that's that they don't know when an attack started. I mentioned earlier about dwell times and attack software laying dormant. And they don't know how long before that software became active, right? And so it's a problem with the intelligence around when that attack started and when it actually got put into place. And then they don't have the capability to recover into a clean environment. And so what's happening is they'll recover data in response to an attack, and that data will have that dormant software in it. And so it gets reactivated and they get reinfected, and you start all over again. And so those are some of the considerations and flexibilities that I think you should be thinking about, again, when you talk about BCDR and cyber recovery plans. Mm-hmm. Tasha, anything to add?
I think the one thing I would add is when there is a disaster or an attack, the pressure is high. So looking at this is bringing in the simplicity and the flexibility, something that allows you to actually be able to do things as quickly as possible and with as much accuracy as possible is important. And then, so there's like this human element of, like you said, doing the practice and investing in a regular check, and then ensuring that the underlying support for how you're going to execute that is able to do it in a way that you feel is as smooth as possible, and know that you have options to make some changes to that if it's not working. And that flexibility really should be that one of those central cores to that. Yeah. Move on to the next one here. Cost. Yeah. Everyone loves to talk about cost because we know that this is one of the biggest hindrances to actually being able to have an effective BCDR plan, to spend the time to keep it up to date. And I think one of the first things we should address here, Adam, is the benefits of cloud. There are obvious economic benefits to cloud, but specific to data security, I think I want to highlight just a few points. One is, when you are using a cloud provider, you have this additional layer to actually harden the security of your data because the vendor is responsible for it, right? And the second is that you don't have to actually have your own data center and the hard costs associated with that. And then you can also leverage their talent resources. So again, going back to part of this skill gap conversation, I think is important. And we had a client, Inspire, who particularly with the pandemic, and they own franchises of restaurants, really, really difficult industry to be in. And so cost to them was important. And in consolidating their legacy solutions, they were actually able to realize a significant amount of TCO. And also, they were really looking at how was implementing Rubrik and Microsoft together going to help with our cost savings for every hour of downtime. And they really had to look at this. And even if you are here and you're not a restaurant, what I like to do with these types of examples is use them for inspiration for the type of optimization I could bring into whatever industry I'm working in. And I think that they've done a good job of that. Couple of other things.
Yeah, and to tie that back, sorry, I was just going to say, just to tie that back to something we were talking about earlier is, think about those cost savings for every hour of downtime if you're having to restore from tape or physically segmented or air-gapped data. That downtime is going to be super costly, as you can see how much they save by having online access to backup data.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the things definitely should mention here is with the Rubrik and Microsoft native integration, we have something called Rubrik Cloud Vault that is a specific, immutable, logically air-gapped vault to secure your data that's specifically focused on recovery. And I'm bringing this up under cost for a few reasons. One would be that you can actually use your Azure consumption commitments through Rubrik, whether it's Rubrik Cloud Vault or other services. And then there's a convenience factor here for the egress charges and being able to recover en masse or at a granular level, right? And so that there's like cost and time and being able to have that recoverability element. And then also there is some very cool cost components here because of the native integration with Microsoft and Rubrik. So yeah, I think it's a great story. Good points. Anything else you want to add to that one, Adam?
I don't think so. Other than just make sure, it's probably stating the obvious, but make sure when you're evaluating technologies that you're evaluating technologies that do have integration points, that do work well, play well together with others. And because you never know what direction your business is going to take you. And so it's always good to have that flexibility, not only in, planning for disaster or cyber threats, but also new applications, new data, new workloads, and having solutions that can plug in together and not only protect your data, but then also work well together when it comes time to recover from an attack or from something else.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. All right. Well, we are going to again thank our co-sponsor Microsoft for doing this with us, and we'd like to spend some time on Q&A. So let's take a look at what we have here.
All right, super. Yeah, great presentation. Appreciate also the references to Mission Impossible. Now that's going through my head as well. And it's always nice to hear about SneakerNet. That's a good oldie but goodie term. So we do have a bunch of questions here from the audience. Here's a first one. Why is it important to have an offsite secure vault as part of our BCDR plan?
Yeah, I could take that one. So as I talked about earlier, there's a couple of different components that are important to think about. One is making sure that you have a copy of your data that is immutable and safe, because the last thing that you want is an attacker being able to prevent you from recovering. And so one way to achieve that is to have a copy of your data offsite. There's kind of a rule of thumb that has been used for years, which is 3-2-1. Have 3 copies of your data on 2 different platforms and one of them offsite. And so having an offsite copy of your data is a way to achieve that. But also, with technological advances, there's ways to achieve that without having to maybe have that data so far away or so inaccessible. That offsite could mean data in the cloud. Natasha was talking about cloud archive earlier. There's also just archiving it to a different building on your campus, or if you want to make sure that you're still recoverable if your city gets hit by a meteor, then you can make sure you're replicating to somewhere outside of that geographic region, or maybe a hurricane or something along those lines. So it's important to have that data and to make sure that it's safe, make sure it's immutable, but also to make sure that it's accessible.
Yeah. Speed to get back up. Want to make sure the business is running. Great summary.
Super. Another question here from Amar, who's asking, do you have to change the zero trust setup when you change vendor?
My thoughts on that, unless you had something, Natasha, was that it kind of depends. And the reason that I say that is zero trust can mean something different, or maybe I should say it this way. Zero trust can be implemented differently by different businesses, by different business units within the same company, by different teams. Zero trust to a SecOps team may be implemented quite differently than zero trust to an IT ops team. And so one of the things we were trying to convey earlier is that, you should be trying to unify those frameworks and get those teams to be kind of rowing the boat in the same direction. So to kind of try to circle back and answer your question, different vendors are going to have different capabilities within the zero trust. And so I would say that if you're changing a vendor, at the very least, you're probably doing an evaluation of how that vendor achieves your zero trust goals, because they may be different. And maybe, the net result is that even though they do it differently, it still achieves the goals and you're still okay. But it certainly warrants a keen eye to look at that and make sure that, again, for example, that maybe they say that they have immutability on their platform, but it's a on-off switch, and you got to select which data you want to be immutable and for how long. Even though technically that achieves that goal, it does it in a different way, and you sort of got to scrutinize that and see if you're okay with that risk, as opposed to something where the immutability capability is part of the platform and it can't be turned on or off, and it's always going to be there, dependable. So hopefully that answers your question. I know that's probably more than you bargained for.
That was good.
Next one here, they're asking, what's a recommended way to do long-term retention?
I think there's a few different ways. Sorry, Natasha, did you?
You go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, a few different ways. One that is growing in popularity and is actually already really popular is Cloud Archive. Leverage the cost benefits of massive scale that the big cloud providers have, like Azure. A terabyte of Azure storage is, it's cheap. So you can ship your data out there, and it's going to be accessible with a provider like Azure. And there's just lots of cost benefits. Now, something that we maybe hinted at but didn't really dive into is a shared responsibility model. So although you can easily get your data out there into Azure, Microsoft doesn't necessarily provide all of the data security components around that data. They make it easy to get data in and out, but they maybe don't, they don't provide any kind of built-in or on by default redundancies. So you have to go in and enable things like cross-region replication or things of that nature. So you have to make sure that you've got capabilities to make sure that that data is safe and accessible and there when you need it. So you can look at something like Rubrik Cloud Vault that adds in, it's basically like a managed service for Cloud Archive. We do all that technical mumbo jumbo for you. So you basically just ship the data out into your Rubrik Cloud Vault directly from your Rubrik cluster or Rubrik Security Cloud, and we take care of making sure that that data is safe. But that's one way to do it. And then there are companies out there that require tape. There's even industries and regulations that they still have to deal with tape. So you have to make sure that you have tape out capabilities and whatever data protection solution you have. And then, almost everybody does some sort of replication. And so it's pretty easy in most circumstances to get multiple copies of that data. And I guess that's a long way of saying the reason why you want to make sure that you have long-term retention is because you just never know how long or how far back you're going to have to go to recover. Sometimes long-term retention means any data that's older than 30 days. I want it out and I want it in the cloud somewhere cheap, because statistically, if I'm going to need to recover, it's probably going to be from 30 days or less in the past. So it means long-term retention means different things to different businesses. So you got to figure out what it means to you and then figure out what the best cost per terabyte kind of model is.
Yeah. I think the only thing that wasn't mentioned there, Adam, that I'll add is you started to allude to it, but one of the reasons, depending on the industry or your business standards, you might have compliance reasons. And, this is really one of the other things that you want to be looking at as part of the plan is staying in compliance. And then, if something happens, how are you reacting from a legal perspective, and are you protected there as well? And prepared to do that work, prepared to work with the authorities for all of the forensics. There's layers to this, and then different applications that you need to be prepared to interact with and like put together to actually deal with each of those elements when that happens, when an attack happens.
Okay, great. It's kind of like a comment from Tony, kind of funny. He says, logical air gap sounds like military intelligence, an oxymoron. I think that, Adam, you touched on this a little bit, in your portion, just like some of the differentiators and what you have to look out for on logical air gap. And I wonder if maybe you could sort of reiterate some of the key things to watch out for there.
Yeah, and look, Tony, like you're not wrong by any stretch of the imagination, but I will challenge a little bit in that the technology has gotten mature enough that and we've found this time and time again with our customers that you really can trust it. You look at some companies that still don't trust it, and we've actually worked with them and provided them solutions and automation to do things like replicating from a Rubrik cluster to another Rubrik cluster. And only during the times of replication, we API into a firewall, we turn on ports, we allow that replication to go through. As soon as it's done, we disable those ports. So we've done all that. And when customers do that and they don't have a regulatory or some other requirement that's pushing them to do that, they kind of take a step back and look at like, wow, that's a lot of complexity, a lot of things that can go wrong. when if I just trusted the technology and verified, right? We're talking about zero trust, and I'm telling you to trust, but verify, validate, continue to test, that you actually have this data. You can have it logically air gapped, so it's online and accessible. And once you learn to trust it, like, your life is just going to be so much easier. But like I said, you got to test it. You got to trust it. If you don't trust it, there's no point. So I would just encourage you to put in a little time and effort to get to that point. And, your vendors, your trusted partners can help you do that. And I think, you'll be a lot happier for it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Next question here comes from Heath, who's asking, would you suggest having a physical backup still today, even with all the cloud solutions?
I think that depends. Would you agree, Adam?
Yeah, totally. Also, I suppose it depends what he means exactly by physical backup. But, as I kind of talked about earlier with 3-2-1, that's sort of applicable here, where, there's different ways to back things up. And, as long as you have multiple copies of your data in multiple different locations, you should be, that is a solid strategy. And whether you achieve that through physical means, all through backup as a service or other means, I don't really think that it matters. But to Natasha's point, it depends on your requirements, it depends on your goals, and you use the right tools that allow you to achieve those goals.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This next one comes from Paul, who's wondering, how often should a business continuity plan be updated, and what elements should it include?
Yeah, I think as often as you can. I think in practical terms, that's maybe quarterly. I've seen folks do it, annually. I don't think that that's often enough. I think quarterly is a good cadence, probably no longer than by semi-annually. And maybe it's something that you're even, once you get mature in your plan and your processes, you're doing a tabletop exercise like every month. That way everything stays fresh. Practice makes perfect. So, I think, Natasha, you kind of mentioned this earlier, where when the pressure's on, when you're under attack and you're trying to recover, you don't want that to be the first time that you're going through this process for real, right? There's plenty of ways to simulate. Yeah, go ahead, Natasha.
No, I was going to say, adding to that, I think in terms of what you should expect, I mean, again, natural disasters have some seasonality to them. And I think in that situation, possibly annual planning was appropriate before. And to your point, like that, as often as possible, the quarterly element almost in itself isn't enough. And I think it's in the state of data security from Rubrik Zero Labs report that you guys can find some stats and recommendations that say basically expect to be hit weekly with some kind of ransomware attack or threat. So if you're not looking at the plan and looking at all the things that happen around this often enough, then you're basically exposed, right? So in terms of what's happening outside that may make you make decisions about the timing, you should be looking at some of those other factors as well.
Yeah, and just one more point to add. If you think about how easy it is to go swipe your credit card and onboard a new cloud application or SaaS application or what have you into your business, that stuff can happen on a daily, a weekly, however often you've got folks that are trying to solve problems. And especially if you're a smaller company where people are empowered to do those things without going through a big chain of command and approval processes, you've got new applications and new data all the time that you probably don't even know about. So going through and doing simulations and tabletops are a great way to expose those weaknesses and then make sure you address them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great points. This next question comes from Dave, and he's raising a question that I think is a challenge, that a lot of people are struggling with, and it's, even though the backup is immutable, how does that prevent the backup from actually backing up bad data? If you're not aware you've been hit with ransomware and the backup is running, wouldn't it back up the encrypted data and possibly the virus itself? What do you tell people about that?
It's a great question. I mean, we can answer from a Rubrik. Yeah, go ahead, Adam.
Okay. I definitely have some opinions here. And like Natasha, I think you were getting ready to go down this road. But, from a Rubrik perspective, even I'll take a step back, even just from a general backup perspective, right? You're running backups all the time. And, you don't really know until you test those backups if those backups are good, whether the data is just corrupted, bad, or encrypted because of an attack. So it's really important to look at your technology stack and make sure that you're looking at those backups. You're doing backup verification and restore validations. And then you're constantly looking at those backups for malware and for cyber threats. So looking at something like, a Rubrik service, ransomware monitoring and investigation, that is constantly scanning your backup data and looking for threats. And then when new threats come out, you can go do some threat hunting in those backups and make sure that you don't have something that was missed and something that's sitting there dormant. So there are definitely ways, like what we talked about earlier, to use that backup data as a honeypot of information to continuously scan and see. Rubrik is going to tell you if it backs up a bunch of new encrypted data. You don't even have to do anything. It's going to flag that and tell you, like, hey, there's something going on here. You need to look at this. And hopefully it's just somebody did something on purpose and it's no big deal, but also like, hey, this is an early indicator of an attack that's happening. And now not only are you alerted to the fact that it's happening, but there's also the intelligence to go in and find out, okay, this has been happening for 72 hours. We need to restore the last clean copy, which is just before that. And Rubrik does all that for you. There's no like, oh crap, I got to go figure out exactly when I can recover from. The technology does that for you. So just make sure you're looking at technology that can provide that kind of value.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Probably got time for a couple more. Here's one from Chris, who's asking, what's the best way to onboard staff and ensure they have the proper training to understand cybersecurity and its impact on our business?
That's a great question. And, it depends. I think having a mature SecOps organization or InfoSec, you might call it, that has a defined set of policies and that, they're regularly not only training employees, not just new employees, but, on some sort of, maybe annual basis, but then also testing employees. I think any InfoSec team that's worth its salt is going to be out there like trying to trip up employees to make sure they know how to identify things like phishing and spear phishing attacks. They're sending those emails, and if you fall for it, it just comes up with a happy little message like, oh, we got you, you need to be smarter, that kind of thing. They should be testing for that. And so part of it is training folks and making them aware of the threats that are out there so they can be diligent and aware, but also testing it and making sure that they're reinforcing that knowledge on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, the one thing I'll add to that, which I think can happen with any IT type topic or even mentioning security, is folks get very serious and dry about it. And this is not an industry that's exempt from all of the evolution of how people learn despite age or abilities, that you need to be considering all the things that make learning interesting and engaging for folks on a regular basis. So I think this is a good question, and maybe something that we can include in a future webinar with some of our internal experts. But these are definitely Adam and I's opinion based on what we've experienced and just looking at the market. But I think it's a good question, and it's one of those things I would also call out from the simplicity factor, looking at as you're reviewing your plan, making sure that onboarding does feel easy and that somebody can get it quickly, because it doesn't take much time for such a mistake like the ones that Adam mentioned to happen.
Yep. All it takes is one.
Yeah.
Well, Natasha, on that note, I'll just say I appreciate you, not making this material dry either. This has been a fun conversation. The back and forth between you guys was great. Appreciate all the insights in the Q&A. And Natasha, before we kind of sign off here, if somebody wants to get started with Rubrik and Microsoft or find out more, we did have some things in the handouts. Anything that you want to recommend?
Yeah, specifically, I'd start with Rubrik.com, and that's where the plethora of all things are. Some, going back to the not so dry part, I enjoy our blogs personally. I think that they're really informative. And there is a Microsoft specific page on there. Those are really great spots. And we've had a couple of other webinars here that we've done with Actual Tech Media that I think are related to this topic. I'd go back and check those out. Those would be the three places that link the handouts we provided, Rubrik.com, and some of the webinars that we've done in the recent weeks.
All right. Tremendous. Well, Natasha and Adam, thank you. Really appreciate you bringing us up to speed on Rubrik and talking through these issues today.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks all.
And before we wrap up, we have one more piece of business. It's the Visa gift card prize drawing. And the winner of that $300 gift card today is Julianne Nollmeyer from Pennsylvania. So congratulations to Julianne. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Rubrik and Microsoft for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending and for all of your great questions. It's been a great Q&A session. Really appreciate all those questions. That concludes today's event. Have a fantastic rest of your day and a great weekend.